By the time officers finished the evening count, the silence felt normal. What they did not see was the message already moving, cell to cell, without paper or ink. In places built to sever human connection, communication becomes a quiet form of resistance. Across American prisons, especially high-security units, isolation has never fully stopped messages from traveling. Facilities like the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum in Florence, Colorado, better known as ADX Florence, were designed to restrict nearly all inmate contact and unsupervised exchange. In these environments, prisoners spend up to 23 hours a day alone. Meals passed through slots, movement tightly scheduled, conversations limited to monitored interactions with staff. Mail is screened, phone calls recorded, visits conducted behind glass. Direct communication between isolated inmates is formally prohibited, and disciplinary action follows any confirmed attempt to bypass controls. Yet even under these restrictions, messages move. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in fragments, but consistently enough that administrators continue adapting policies to contain them. If stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps us keep uncovering how systems function behind closed doors. One of the oldest methods is known informally as phishing. It requires no tools beyond what already exists inside a cell. An inmate tears a strip from a bedsheet or shirt, knots several strips together, and lowers the makeshift line beneath the cell door toward the tier. Another inmate does the same. When the weighted ends cross, they tangle them together and pull, transferring notes, drawings, or small items between cells without direct contact. Correctional departments have documented this practice for decades. In high-security units, officers conduct routine searches specifically to intercept these lines before they carry anything significant. But confiscating the lines does not eliminate the impulse. It only changes the method. In some facilities, inmates communicate through plumbing systems. Metal toilets and sink fixtures share pipe networks that carry sound surprisingly well through solid concrete. By placing an ear near the drain and speaking directly into the bowl, voices can travel several cells down, distorted but understandable with repetition and patience. Staff are aware of this tactic. In certain control units, water is periodically flushed or pipes modified to reduce acoustic transmission. Even so, brief exchanges still occur, often at night when ambient noise drops and officers rotate through quieter posts. Sometimes communication requires no objects at all. It relies entirely on sound patterns. In solitary housing, inmates have tapped on walls using agreed codes, often adaptations of the classic tap code historically used by prisoners of war. A sequence of knocks can represent letters, names, or simple confirmations that someone else is present beyond the concrete. Prison administrators recognize tapping as a form of unauthorized communication. Disciplinary reports in several state systems reference inmates warned or sanctioned for persistent wall knocking. But suppressing it completely is difficult. Concrete carries vibration, and isolation intensifies the need for acknowledgement. What makes these exchanges significant is not just what is said, but why they continue despite the risk. Isolation units exist to separate individuals considered violent, influential, or disruptive within the general population. Preventing coordinated action is a central goal. In the 1990s and early 2000s, control units at facilities such as Pelican Bay State Prison in California were specifically structured to limit gang communication. Investigations later revealed that some inmates still managed to pass coded messages along tiers, influencing activity in other housing areas. Court filings and investigative journalism documented how handwritten notes, sometimes called kites, traveled through improvised delivery methods despite constant searches. Administrators responded with enhanced surveillance, additional shakedowns, and stricter property limits. The cycle repeated. Mail screening became more aggressive nationwide after several high-profile security incidents. Letters were photocopied, originals withheld, and suspicious language flagged for review. In recent years, some departments have outsourced mail processing to external vendors, digitizing correspondence before delivery to inmates. These steps reduce contraband risks, but they do not eliminate indirect communication through legal mail. Inmates may write in coded language that appears ordinary to untrained readers, relying on shared context developed over years. Authorities have testified in federal cases about intercepted letters that contained hidden instructions embedded in routine personal updates. Still, proving intent behind ambiguous phrasing is complex, and not every coded suspicion leads to disciplinary action. Phone calls offer another monitored channel. Every call in high-security federal facilities is recorded and subject to review. Despite that, transcripts introduced in court have shown inmates using layered language, references to outside events, or third-party intermediaries to relay meaning. Correctional intelligence units dedicate significant resources to analyzing such communication, especially when it involves organized criminal groups. But even with monitoring, interpretation takes time. And by the time a pattern becomes clear, the message may already have reached its destination. Technology has added new dimensions. Smuggled cell phones have been discovered in state and federal prisons across the country. Contraband devices bypass institutional monitoring entirely, allowing encrypted messaging and social media access when not detected. Law enforcement agencies regularly announce seizures of phones during coordinated searches, sometimes uncovering broader criminal networks connected to incarcerated individuals. However, even in facilities with intense security like ADX Florence, documented cases show that absolute prevention remains an ongoing challenge. What followed surprised even experienced staff in several investigations. In certain instances, inmates have used official grievance procedures to transmit information indirectly, embedding references within formal complaints that travel through administrative channels. While grievances are reviewed by staff, they also generate paper trails that move across departments and sometimes beyond the prison walls. The line between legitimate complaint and concealed messaging can be difficult to define without clear evidence of coordination. Attorneys and legal mail present another layer. Communication with legal counsel is protected and generally not read for content, only inspected for contraband. Federal regulations strictly limit staff intrusion into privileged legal correspondence. That protection is fundamental to due process. But it also creates areas where investigators must rely on external evidence rather than internal monitoring. Few people outside ever learned how small signals can carry significant meaning in these spaces. An extra fold in a letter, a phrase repeated across multiple correspondences, or a seemingly harmless reference can serve as confirmation to someone waiting. Even when officials intercept physical notes, the question remains whether the message was already understood before it was seized. Inside high-security housing units, timing becomes as important as content, because a signal delivered seconds earlier can change behavior across an entire tier. In some documented cases, inmates have synchronized actions without ever meeting face-to-face, relying on patterns built through repeated exposure to the same routines. Meal delivery schedules, recreation rotations, and count procedures create predictable windows where brief exchanges become possible despite constant supervision. A single word shouted during escort might appear meaningless to staff, but meaningful to someone listening several doors away. Correctional intelligence reports have repeatedly emphasized how routine itself becomes a communication tool within restrictive housing. When inmates know precisely when doors open or when officers rotate posts, they can coordinate sound or movement within those narrow margins. But that was only part of the strategy. In several state systems, investigators uncovered instances where messages moved not just horizontally between cells, but vertically through tiers and plumbing shafts. Multi-level housing blocks sometimes carry sound through shared vent systems, allowing brief, distorted conversations between floors. Facilities have attempted to retrofit vents or insert sound dampening barriers, yet architectural limitations complicate full containment. Every structural weakness becomes an opportunity once it is recognized. Historically, gang investigations in California and the Federal Bureau of Prisons documented how leadership figures maintained influence despite long-term isolation. Validation hearings and federal court testimony described coded references passed through correspondence, visitation, or intermediaries. These findings influenced policy reforms, including step-down programs designed to reduce prolonged solitary confinement. Administrators concluded that cutting communication entirely did not always dismantle organizational structure. Sometimes it merely obscured it. That realization shifted attention toward monitoring patterns rather than simply blocking contact. In high-profile federal prosecutions, recorded calls revealed conversations that sounded ordinary but later aligned with external criminal activity. Analysts compared transcripts across months, identifying recurring phrases that functioned as informal signals. This work requires time, specialized training, and collaboration with outside law enforcement agencies. But interpretation is rarely immediate. By the time analysts connect coded references to real-world outcomes, consequences may already be unfolding beyond the prison walls. That delay is one of the most persistent challenges correctional systems face. And yet, not every hidden message is about criminal coordination. Former inmates have described using tapping or plumbing conversations simply to confirm another human presence during prolonged isolation. Psychologists who study solitary confinement note that sensory deprivation intensifies the need for acknowledgement. A brief exchange, even limited to a name or greeting, can reduce feelings of complete disconnection. Correctional departments must balance that reality against security mandates. In many jurisdictions, policies prohibit unauthorized communication regardless of intent, because distinguishing harmless contact from coordinated planning is complex. Disciplinary records show inmates losing privileges for repeated wall tapping or possession of improvised lines. But enforcement varies depending on facility culture, staffing levels, and perceived risk. In maximum security federal units, consequences are typically formal and documented. In some state facilities, responses may include warnings before escalating to sanctions. The variability itself shapes behavior. When inmates observe uneven enforcement, experimentation increases. What followed in several investigations highlighted how adaptive these efforts can become. In New York and California facilities, officers reported discovering messages written in microscopic script hidden inside book bindings or beneath postage stamps. Screening procedures now include ultraviolet lights, physical page inspections, and random content analysis. Despite these precautions, the volume of mail makes complete scrutiny nearly impossible. Digital communication platforms have introduced new oversight mechanisms. Some state systems replaced in-person visits with video kiosks, reducing physical contact but increasing electronic monitoring capacity. Video sessions are recorded, stored, and subject to review when concerns arise. Still, language can be layered in ways that pass through routine review without immediate suspicion. Even gesture-based communication through a screen may carry meaning not obvious to casual observers. Correctional staff often rely on intelligence gathered from multiple sources to interpret isolated incidents. A single coded phrase may not trigger action, but repetition across different channels can elevate concern. Information sharing between facilities also plays a role. When inmates transfer between prisons, their communication patterns sometimes follow. Federal databases track affiliations and disciplinary histories, providing context for future monitoring. But even with data systems in place, human judgment remains central. Officers must decide whether a behavior signals coordination or simply restlessness within confinement. Few outside the system recognize how much interpretation shapes daily decisions behind secure doors. Misreading a signal can either overstate a threat or overlook one. That uncertainty drives constant policy adjustments. Over the past decade, reforms aimed at reducing extended solitary confinement have altered communication dynamics. Step-down units introduce limited group interaction under supervision, which can reduce covert signaling but introduce new variables. Officials argue that structured engagement can decrease the incentive to pass secret messages. Critics counter that isolation itself fuels the need for hidden communication. The debate continues in legislatures and courtrooms nationwide. Meanwhile, inside control units, small adaptations persist. An inmate may memorize a legal citation to reference in conversation, knowing it signals alignment without appearing suspicious. Another may coordinate the timing of grievances to indicate sequence rather than content. Each method depends on shared understanding built long before isolation. What remains constant is the institutional effort to respond. Training academies now include modules on identifying covert communication tactics. Intelligence officers analyze trends across facilities, searching for patterns that suggest emerging methods. Technology upgrades focus on scanning, recording, and data integration. But no system operates in perfect silence. As long as individuals remain confined together, even separately, attempts to connect will continue. And sometimes the most concerning messages are the ones no one realizes were sent at all. There have been moments when administrators believed they had finally closed every visible channel. Lines were confiscated, vents sealed, mail digitized, calls recorded, visits monitored, and housing units redesigned to minimize even accidental eye contact between isolated prisoners. On paper, the system appeared airtight. Yet internal reviews and court testimony across multiple states show that communication attempts never fully disappeared. They simply evolved into quieter, less predictable forms. In federal supermax environments, including ADX Florence, the architecture itself is intended to suppress interaction. Solid doors replace bars, recreation occurs alone in enclosed areas, and movement is tightly choreographed to prevent proximity between high-risk inmates. Even so, former staff have acknowledged in interviews and congressional briefings that isolation reduces but does not erase ingenuity. The motivation behind these efforts varies widely. Some attempts are linked to maintaining influence within criminal organizations, particularly when incarcerated leaders seek to preserve authority beyond prison walls. Other attempts reflect something far more basic. Human beings placed in prolonged isolation often search for confirmation that someone else is still there. That distinction complicates enforcement. When correctional departments investigate intercepted communication, they must determine whether the content represents coordinated misconduct or simple contact. The consequences differ significantly. A confirmed security threat can trigger placement reviews, transfer to stricter units, or referral for federal prosecution. But minor unauthorized communication may result only in loss of privileges or disciplinary reports. The gray space between those outcomes demands careful analysis. In several federal cases over the past 2 decades, prosecutors introduced recorded calls and seized letters as evidence of coded communication tied to outside crimes. Judges weighed not only the language used, but patterns across time. These cases shaped how intelligence units approach analysis today. Rather than reacting to isolated incidents, many departments now focus on cumulative behavior. A phrase repeated in multiple calls, a grievance filed in sequence with another inmate, or synchronized disruptions during count may signal coordination when viewed together. Data systems help assemble those fragments. But technology alone cannot interpret meaning. Correctional intelligence officers often rely on experience, cultural knowledge of specific groups, and collaboration with outside agencies. Even then, certainty is rare. False positives can lead to restrictive measures against inmates who intended no broader misconduct. False negatives can allow coordinated behavior to continue undetected. That balance sits at the center of modern isolation policy. Meanwhile, reform movements have questioned whether extreme isolation reduces or amplifies hidden communication. Research on solitary confinement suggests that prolonged sensory deprivation increases anxiety, hypervigilance, and fixation on small signals. Under those conditions, even ambiguous sounds may take on exaggerated meaning. Some states have responded by limiting the length of solitary placements and expanding step-down programs. These reforms aim to reduce the psychological pressure that can fuel both covert communication and disciplinary conflict. Early evaluations show mixed outcomes. In certain facilities, structured interaction decreased rule violations. In others, intelligence units reported new methods of passing information within group settings. Policy continues to evolve in response. Federal oversight bodies and civil rights litigation have also influenced communication controls. Court decisions have reinforced the protection of legal mail and access to counsel, even in the highest security units. That protection creates necessary safeguards for constitutional rights. At the same time, it limits how far monitoring can extend without crossing legal boundaries. Administrators must design systems that preserve due process while protecting institutional security. Few operational environments demand that balance more intensely. Across the country, prison architecture is slowly shifting. Newer facilities incorporate surveillance technology, improved acoustic insulation, and digital tracking of inmate movement. Older prisons, however, were not built with those capabilities in mind. Retrofitting concrete structures constructed decades ago is costly and often incomplete. As a result, inconsistencies persist between facilities. An approach effective in one institution may fail in another because of structural differences alone. Through all these adjustments, one pattern remains consistent. When individuals are confined, they search for connection, influence, or reassurance. Security systems respond. Methods change. Countermeasures follow. The cycle continues. What rarely reaches public attention is how small most of these exchanges actually are. A brief tap sequence. A coded reference in a letter that appears ordinary. A synchronized pause during a routine procedure. Individually, they may seem insignificant. Collectively, they reveal how communication adapts under constraint. For correctional leaders, the challenge is not only stopping prohibited messages. It is recognizing which signals matter and which represent the human response to isolation itself. Absolute silence has proven impossible. The question has shifted toward management rather than elimination. In hearings, policy reviews, and academic studies, experts continue debating how much control is realistic without undermining fundamental rights. Meanwhile, inside high-security units, the quiet exchanges persist at the edges of detection. Sometimes intercepted, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes unnoticed entirely. And in institutions designed to separate people completely, the smallest signal can still travel farther than anyone expects. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.